Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and for the next several weeks, I will be uploading a series of videos in which I have animated Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign. It is touted by some as one of the greatest military feats in world history, and the event that solidified Jackson as a military icon to the Confederacy. I hope you enjoy this series. It has been one of the hardest animations to date, but I have loved every second of it. After the First Battle of Manassas, the Confederate Army of the Potomac sat idle in northern Virginia. Some generals, Thomas Stonewall Jackson included, urged for a pursuit of the Federals and/or an attack on Washington, D.C. The Confederate High Command waved off those ideas. In northwestern Virginia, prominent commanders later in the war fought along the boundaries of Virginia and Maryland, including William S. Rosecrans and Robert E. Lee. One reason for troops sent to that district was the vital Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, as well as the C&O Canal. When the southern states seceded from the Union, states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas blocked off the Mississippi River. Prior to the war, Midwestern farmers in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Iowa, and Wisconsin depended on river travel to get their goods to market. Additionally, railroads that ran from north to south became cut off as well. Now that the Confederacy prevented trade from taking place along the river and along those rail lines, the Midwestern farmers sought another way to get goods to market. They turned toward west to east trade along railroads and canals, two prominent ones being the B&O Railroad and the C&O Canal. Confederate destruction of the railroad and attempts to make the canal useless threatened the flow of goods from west to east. Railroads further north could transport them, but each railroad or waterway that became incapable of transportation drove freight costs up, further hurting the Midwestern farmers. Abraham Lincoln wanted the flow of goods for military purposes, but also to relieve the financial problems of farmers who now faced the ever-increasing possibility that it could cost more to ship these goods to market than they would get in return for their crops. Low morale from financial despair could result in citizens turning against prosecuting the war. Therefore, securing the northwestern portion of Virginia and Maryland became integral to the Union war effort. Also on the minds of the Union High Command was the rich agricultural region of the Shenandoah Valley. From the time settlement started in the valley, Virginians prospered financially from growing corn and, more importantly, wheat for the state and the nation. Beyond agriculture, the valley possessed significant industry, including iron furnaces, tanneries, and lumber mills, all necessary for the Confederate war effort. However, the Confederacy faced problems in the valley. Unionist sympathies ran high, especially the closer to the Potomac River and the Maryland border one went. Their close ties to the north made them financially reliant on northern manufacturers and purchasing agents, which created a hostile borderland for both the Union and the Confederacy as segments of the population began to take sides. Losing the Shenandoah Valley meant losing a major area of production and agriculture for the Confederacy, which made securing it even more important. The Confederacy stationed units in the valley, but Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, sought to place someone acquainted with the area in command of the valley. Stonewall Jackson's name came forth from the people in the valley and the Confederate High Command, knowing that he hailed from Lexington, Virginia. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston balked at losing one of his more capable commanders, but agreed to send him minus the famed Stonewall Brigade. Winchester, one of the main towns in the valley, became the headquarters of Jackson when he arrived in November 1861. Union forces in the region were under the command of Nathaniel Banks, who knew the importance of the B&O Railroad and the C&O Canal. His mildly aggressive stance contrasted with his superior George McClellan's defensive stance. Banks made his headquarters at Frederick, Maryland, but kept a smattering of troops on the border and in Virginia. One of Banks' subordinates, Brigadier General Frederick Lander, fought for an aggressive campaign in northwest Virginia. Lander, born in Massachusetts, crossed the United States surveying for railroads to link the east and west coast, and even surveyed the Lander Road as an alternative to get to the Oregon Territory. He constantly petitioned Banks and McClellan to allow him to take troops into the valley, but both generals hesitated issuing the orders. At Edwards Ferry, Lander received an ugly bullet wound in the leg. This incapacitated him and prevented him from taking the field like he wanted. As the commander in the valley, Jackson took on an important role as the far left flank of the Confederate Army of the Potomac under Joseph E. Johnston at Centerville. If Union forces captured the valley, Johnston's left flank could easily come under threat from Union troops moving up the valley and through one of the many gaps and surprising his army. Likewise, the presence of Johnston's army protected Jackson's right flank, but Stonewall still worried about his left. A Union force at Romney worried him the most, and when he got reinforced by the Army of the Northwest under General William Loring, he launched an expedition against Union forces to the west. On January 1, 1862, Jackson set out with around 9,000 men from Winchester toward the town of Bath. It was unusually warm at the start, but quickly a snowstorm drifted in, freezing the soldiers who had left their overcoats and blankets behind or in supply wagons. The Federal troops around that town withdrew under orders from McClellan and Banks, who wanted to wait until spring to make any move into Virginia. Jackson then pressed on to the Potomac River across from the town of Hancock. Lander's men occupied the town, and Jackson gave the Union commander 2 hours to evacuate the citizens. Lander refused to surrender or leave and withstood the shelling from the Confederate artillery. Jackson detached part of his command to destroy sections of the B&O Railroad and attempt to bust a dam for the C&O Canal, but no great progress could be made against the canal's dam. Unable to cause any significant damage to Lander's men, Jackson then set off for Romney. Again, those Federals had withdrawn, leaving it in the hands of Jackson's men. But the journey to capture Romney came with consequences. The men froze as they marched, and those that could had to help push artillery and wagons up hills covered in ice, and held them back so not to shove the horses into the hard ground. Despite their efforts, many horses received broken legs and other injuries, along with rank-and-file soldiers getting injured and sick from exposure. Loring and men in his command went above Jackson's head to the Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, asking that Jackson be relieved of command for endangering the lives of his men. Jackson offered his resignation in protest, which the President would not accept. To soothe the anger of both men, the Secretary of War transferred Loring and some of his regiments out of Jackson's command. To prevent further injury to his army, Jackson moved his brigades from Romney to Winchester, where they could recuperate. However, disease, desertion, and furloughs greatly reduced his fighting force. Year-long enlistments were coming up in the spring, and Jefferson Davis signed a law giving a furlough to those men who re-enlisted. Although it would raise morale, it depleted Jackson's ranks. Word from deserters and spies relayed the information to Banks that Jackson possessed few troops and would ultimately have to fall back, especially since Johnston was pulling back to Culpeper. In late February, Banks's forces crossed the Potomac River under the supervision of McClellan. By March 2nd, Williams's brigade captured Martinsburg, and the other Federal brigades and divisions began to close in on the Confederate force in Winchester. On March 7th, Williams moved up the valley toward Winchester and encountered Turner Ashby's cavalry, who they pushed aside, gaining more information about the state of Jackson's force at Winchester. On March 10th, Jackson declared martial law on the town, arresting several dozen men who had held a Union meeting in anticipation of Union forces occupying the town. The situation was becoming dire as Jackson only possessed a little under 5,000 men, being outnumbered by the approaching Federals 6-1. He needed to act before it was too late.